It was a day like any other, until a single comment would shatter the air, rippling through the classroom and leaving everyone in stunned silence. The tension in the room hung thick, almost as if the walls themselves could feel the weight of what had just transpired. It wasn't the typical classroom exchange. This was something deeper, more personal, something that no one in the room would ever forget. It began with a simple lesson, a teacher standing in front, discussing something that seemed unremarkable at the time. The students sat in their seats, absorbed in their work, the hum of quiet conversations filling the space. But everything shifted when the teacher turned to one student, a teenager who had been silently working at the back of the room, his head down as he concentrated. The teacher's voice cut through the noise, a remark aimed directly at him. It was casual at first, but the tone quickly shifted. A joke, maybe, or an insult, whatever it was sharp and unmistakable. The words stung, and the classroom fell deathly silent. You could see the change on the teen's face. His expression didn't immediately shift to anger or frustration, but something much deeper, a calm, controlled reaction that seemed almost out of place in the heated moment. There was no immediate outburst, no rash words thrown back. Instead, he looked at the teacher, then at his classmates, and in that moment, everyone seemed to hold their breath, unsure of what would come next. It wasn't just the comment itself that shocked the room, but the teen's response. It wasn't what anyone expected. Rather than reacting impulsively, he did something that turned the entire situation on its head. With grace and composure, he stood up and faced the teacher, his voice steady and firm. It wasn't an argument, it wasn't a rebuttal. It was something more, a simple yet powerful message that left the room speechless. The teacher stood frozen, caught off guard by the teen's calm demeanor. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed like time had slowed down. Everyone around them watched in silence, unsure whether to intervene or just witness the unfolding moment. It was as if the very air in the room had thickened, heavy with the weight of what had just happened and the uncertainty of what was about to follow. As the class looked on, the teen didn't raise his voice or lash out. Instead, he spoke in a way that commanded attention, not with anger, but with clarity, his words cutting through the atmosphere like a sharp blade, delivering a message not just to the teacher, but to everyone in the room. The teacher, once confident and in control, now found themselves questioning everything. They hadn't expected this response. They hadn't expected a moment of truth to come from the very person they had underestimated. The room seemed to hold its breath as the tension built, leaving everyone wondering how this would all resolve. Would the teacher apologize? Would the situation escalate further? Or would this be a moment of change that no one could predict? As the teen stood there, calm and resolute, something shifted not just in the teacher, but in the whole room. There was a shift in perspective, a collective realization that this wasn't just about one comment or one response. It was about something deeper, the way people saw each other, the assumptions made, and the power of standing up for oneself in the face of injustice. But the story doesn't end here. What happened next would leave everyone speechless, a twist that no one saw coming. The response, the unexpected turn of events, would change everything, leaving us to wonder what would come next. Would this be the last time the teacher made such an assumption? Or would this encounter spark something much bigger, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew? The stage is set, the tension is high, and the story is far from over. The question now remains, what happens when words are used as weapons, and how do we respond when the world around us shifts in unexpected ways? Stay tuned, because the next part of this story is something you won't want to miss. The room was still, a fragile silence hanging in the air as the tension between the student and teacher pulsed like an invisible force. The class, once filled with the usual hum of activity, was now trapped in a moment that felt suspended in time. Everyone's eyes were on the teacher, but no one dared to speak. The words had been said, and the sting of them still lingered, like an uncomfortable weight on the chest. The teacher had made a mistake. Everyone in the room knew it, even if no one dared to say it out loud. It wasn't that the comment was overtly offensive or cruel, but it was a reminder of the subtle biases that people carried, the assumptions that lingered just beneath the surface. For the teacher, it was just another passing remark, part of a routine. But for the teen, it was something else, a reminder that, no matter how far society had come, there were still moments where people were judged not for who they were, but for what others assumed about them. The teen had always been different in that class. He wasn't the loudest or the most outspoken, but he had a presence that was hard to ignore. People around him knew he was smart, knew he was capable, but there was always a sense that he was carrying something with him. Something that had nothing to do with his academic ability, but everything to do with how he was seen in the world. He was a teenager with a quiet strength, someone who had learned early on to keep his emotions in check, not because he didn't feel them, but because he knew that in this world, vulnerability could be seen as a weakness. It wasn't that the teacher was a bad person. She wasn't. But she had grown comfortable in her role, perhaps too comfortable. Over the years, she had built an image of herself as a strong, confident educator, someone who knew how to keep control of her classroom, someone who could read her students with ease. But that day, in that moment, the teacher had miscalculated. She had made an assumption about the teen, something that many people did without thinking, something that was so ingrained in the fabric of society that it often went unnoticed. For the teen, it wasn't the first time. It wasn't the first time he had been misunderstood, misjudged, or overlooked. There were countless instances in his life where people had placed him into a box, categorized him based on what they assumed about his background, his appearance, his race. He had learned to keep his head down, to avoid conflict, to just get through the day without rocking the boat. But something about the teacher's comment had struck a nerve. It wasn't just the insult itself, it was the assumption that lay beneath it, the idea that his worth could be defined by someone else's perception. And so, in that moment, he made a choice. Rather than responding with anger, with a sharp retort or an outburst, he decided to respond with something that would make them think. He chose silence, but it was a powerful kind of silence. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that demanded attention without uttering a single word. The teacher, for her part, seemed to realize that she had made a mistake almost immediately. But rather than apologize or acknowledge the hurt she had caused, she doubled down, trying to cover her tracks with a half-hearted joke or a nervous laugh. It was a classic defense mechanism. When people feel uncomfortable, they often try to deflect the discomfort with humor or by brushing off the situation. But it wasn't working. The room was still tense, and the teen wasn't moving, wasn't backing down. The other students were now aware of the shift. Some were uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. Others had already formed opinions about what had just happened. They had seen it, felt it. It wasn't just the words the teacher had said, it was the unspoken truths that hung in the air. They had all been complicit, in one way or another, in allowing these things to happen. In their own way, each of them had been witness to moments like this, moments where someone was made to feel smaller, to feel lesser, because of something beyond their control. As the minutes dragged on, the teacher tried to regain her composure, but the damage had been done. The class had shifted. The space between the teacher and the teen had grown wider, an invisible chasm that no one knew how to bridge. The students, once passive observers, were now active participants in a situation they hadn't signed up for. They were stuck, frozen in place, as they waited for the next move. The teen's eyes were calm, unwavering. He didn't need to say anything to make his point clear. His presence alone was enough. He was the embodiment of quiet strength, a teenager who had learned that sometimes, the most powerful response wasn't the loudest one, but the one that came from within. He had known for a long time that words were powerful, but that actions could be even more so. And yet, the question remained, what would happen next? Would the teacher finally acknowledge her mistake? Would she apologize? Would the teen respond with the same composure, or would the simmering tension eventually boil over? The students couldn't stop thinking about it. They were on edge, each one grappling with the uncomfortable truth of what had just unfolded. Some wondered how the teacher would react, if she would try to salvage the situation. Others worried about the teen. How long could he keep up this calm exterior? They had seen him before, had seen how he interacted with others, but today felt different. There was something in the way he carried himself now, something that made everyone pause. The class continued, but the mood had shifted. The usual rhythm of the day had been disrupted, and no one knew how to get it back. The teacher kept glancing at the teen, as though hoping for some sort of response, but he remained silent, his eyes focused on the front of the room. It was as if he had already moved on, already processing the moment in a way that no one else could quite grasp. Outside the classroom, the day continued, the world carrying on without a care. But inside, everything had changed. The balance of power had shifted, even if no one knew how to navigate this new dynamic. Everyone was left wondering what would happen next. Would the teacher apologize, or would the silence between them grow deeper, more uncomfortable with each passing moment? The bell rang at the end of class, signaling the end of the day. But as the students gathered their things and filed out of the room, the memory of the exchange lingered in air. The teacher and the teen locked eyes one final time, but neither spoke. The door closed behind the last student, and the room was left in silence. The tension wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And as the teacher sat alone in the empty classroom, she couldn't help but wonder if she had just witnessed something that would change everything, something that would force her to confront her own biases, her own assumptions, and perhaps even her own understanding of what it meant to truly teach. The teen, for his part, had made a choice, and he wasn't going to back down now. What came next would define the rest of his journey, not just in that classroom, but in his life. And no one, not even the teacher, could predict how it would all unfold. The next day, the classroom felt different. There was an unspoken weight in the air that no one could quite shake off. It wasn't just the teen who felt it, it was everyone. The teacher entered, her usual confident demeanor slightly shaken. She had spent the night reflecting, questioning the comment she'd made and the consequences of it. Had she gone too far? Had she crossed a line that she didn't even realize existed? She tried to push those thoughts away, to regain control, but they lingered, like shadows that refused to dissipate. The students shuffled in, their chatter quieter than usual, as if they were all trying to process the awkwardness of what had happened the day before. Some couldn't stop whispering about the teen's response. They had never seen him like that, so calm, so composed, like he had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally chosen to set it down. It was almost as if the situation had unlocked something inside him, something that none of them fully understood. The teen, however, was just as silent as before. He sat in his usual seat, eyes on the desk, hands folded neatly in front of him. His face was an unreadable mask, but those who knew him best could sense the shift. There was a new resolve in him, something different in the way he carried himself. It wasn't anger, but it was something deeper, something that seemed to radiate from him quietly but forcefully. He wasn't just reacting to the teacher anymore, he was processing everything, from the years of quiet judgment to the countless times his worth had been overlooked or reduced to assumptions. But for now, he said nothing. The teacher began the lesson, but it was clear that her mind wasn't fully in it. She kept glancing toward the teen, her gaze lingering just a little too long, as though waiting for some sign of forgiveness, some indication that the balance could be restored. But there was nothing. He didn't look at her. He didn't give her the satisfaction of acknowledgement. And the longer she stared at him, the more it became clear this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple apology. This was something much bigger than that. In the back of the room, a group of students whispered among themselves. They had all noticed the shift, the tension that seemed to hang between the teacher and the teen. It wasn't just the way teacher had acted, it was the way everyone around them had reacted. The room had been divided, with some students siding with the teacher, believing it was just a misunderstanding, while others felt uncomfortable, questioning how things had unfolded. And there were a few who had felt the sting of the comment themselves, even if they hadn't said anything. They knew exactly what it was like to feel invisible, to feel judged based on something beyond their control. One of the students, a girl who had always been quiet in class, had been particularly shaken by the exchange. She had seen how the teacher's words affected the teen, and it had stirred something inside her, a long-buried feeling of frustration with the way things had always been. She had grown up seeing how certain people were treated differently, how assumptions were made based on appearances, on skin color, on background. And for the first time in a long time, she realized that what happened in the classroom was just another manifestation of something much larger. Something that affected everyone, whether they realized it or not. Her heart raced as she tried to keep her attention on the lesson, but her mind kept drifting back to the moment when the teacher had made the comment, and the way the teen had stood there, silent but powerful. She couldn't help but wonder, was he really okay? Was he just putting on a brave face, or was he dealing with something deeper, something no one else could see? Across the room, another student watched the quiet exchange with a sense of unease. He wasn't sure where he stood in all of this. He had always gotten along with everyone, tried to stay out of the drama, but this situation felt different. It felt like the kind of moment that would shape the rest of their high school years. The problem was, he wasn't sure of whose side to take. He had heard the teacher's comment, and it hadn't sat right with him. But at the same time, he wasn't sure if the teen's response had been overblown, if it had been too much for such a small thing. He wrestled with his thoughts, but as the class went on, it became harder to ignore the feeling in his gut that something important was at stake here, something that went beyond the classroom, beyond the lesson. He knew he couldn't just sit by and watch. He had to do something. But what? The tension continued to build, until it became impossible to ignore. The teacher, noticing the growing discomfort in the room, tried once more to break the silence, to re-establish some semblance of normalcy. She called on a student to answer a question, but the response was hesitant, awkward. No one was fully engaged anymore. Everyone's thoughts were still caught in the previous day's exchange, and the questions left unanswered: what had made the teen react that way, and what did it mean for the teacher, for the students, for the class? As the bell rang and the students began to gather their things, the tension didn't dissipate. It lingered, hanging over them like a dark cloud, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next. Would the teacher address the situation? Would she finally apologize, or would she double down again? And would the teen respond, or would he remain as silent as ever? Outside the classroom, the world continued. Students laughed and joked as they left the building, but for some, the weight of what had happened still pressed on them. There was an unspoken understanding now, a realization that this wasn't just about one comment, one response. It was about something deeper, something that had been simmering for a long time, something that needed to be confronted but no one knew how. The girl, who had been quietly disturbed by the incident, decided that she couldn't ignore it anymore. She needed to talk to someone, to make sense of what had happened. But who could she talk to? She couldn't go to the teacher, she knew that much. And the other students didn't seem like they would understand. They were too focused on the surface, on the little details, while she was trying to see the bigger picture. She needed someone who could see what she saw. The teen, for his part, had his own struggles to deal with. The moment had passed, but the feelings it had stirred didn't go away. He walked through the halls, head down, lost in his thoughts. He had always been a quiet observer, but now, something inside him was pushing him to speak up, to stand up, to not let things like this slide anymore. He wasn't sure what that would look like yet, but he knew that he couldn't let it go. He hadn't spoken to anyone about what had happened, but he felt as though the world was pressing in on him from all sides. The unspoken expectations, the assumptions, the judgments, it was all too much. But what could he do about it? How could he make them understand? The classroom had become a battleground of sorts, a microcosm of a larger, more complex world. The teacher, the students, and the teen were all caught in a web of tension that was only growing tighter. The question now was, how long could they all hold out before something had to give? As the day drew to a close, the tension was still there, hanging over them like a storm ready to break. The days following the incident passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. The tension in the classroom was palpable, and every glance, every word spoken, felt loaded with meaning. The teen's quiet resolve remained unchanged. He didn't speak out, didn't show signs of cracking, but everyone could tell that he was carrying something inside him, a quiet storm that threatened to break at any moment. His classmates, watching from the sidelines, whispered amongst themselves, unsure of what to make of it all. Some wanted to reach out, to offer support, but they didn't know how. Others were simply too scared, too unsure of their own feelings to step forward. Meanwhile, the teacher struggled with her own guilt and confusion. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about the words she had said, and the look in his eyes when he'd walked away. She had tried to convince herself that it was just a momentary lapse, a misunderstanding, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. She had said something that had hit a nerve, something that had triggered a deeper reaction than she had anticipated. She found herself pacing in her office after class, running over the events in her mind, trying to figure out what went wrong. She had always prided herself on being a fair teacher, one who could connect with her students, who understood the struggles they faced. But this was different. She could no longer ignore the fact that what had happened wasn't just about a simple comment, it was about the layers of assumptions, of biases, of unspoken rules that governed their interactions. It was about race, yes, but it was also about power, about who got to define the rules, about who got to speak and who had to stay silent. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply ingrained these issues were, how many times she had probably unknowingly contributed to the same system she now found herself questioning. And it made her uneasy, terrified, even. She couldn't just apologize and pretend things were okay. She couldn't fix it with a few kind words. The wound was too deep for that. Meanwhile, the teen had begun to withdraw even further. His usual friends, the ones he had laughed with and joked around with before, couldn't break through his silence. They tried, of course. They asked him about his day, about his thoughts on the lesson, but he gave nothing in return. His mind seemed to be elsewhere, distant, as though he had already moved on from the classroom and into a world of his own. A world where the rules didn't apply the same way, where he didn't have to be anyone's idea of who he was supposed to be. But the withdrawal wasn't a sign of defeat. It was a way for him to gather strength, to reflect on everything that had led to this moment. He wasn't just thinking about the teacher's comment, he was thinking about everything that had ever been said, everything that had ever been done to him because of the color of his skin. He thought about the countless times he had been underestimated, the times when people assumed he didn't have what it took, the times he had been dismissed because his experiences didn't fit into someone else's idea of what was right. What happened in that classroom wasn't just a personal slight. It was a reminder of a bigger, much more complicated system, a system that operated in subtle, insidious ways that most people never had to think about because they didn't feel the weight of it. But he felt it. Every day. And now, as the days dragged on, he began to realize that the time for silence was over. He couldn't let it slide anymore. He couldn't let this moment pass without doing something about it, even if he didn't know what that something was yet. He spent his nights writing, jotting down his thoughts, his frustrations, trying to make sense of it all. The words flowed from his pen in a way they never had before. He wrote about the pain of being underestimated, about the difficulty of finding a space where he truly belonged, about the ways people could be so quick to judge without ever understanding the full story. His mind was racing, his thoughts crashing together in a whirlwind of emotion. He didn't know how to fix everything, how to change the system, but he knew he had to start somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something bigger than he could even comprehend right now. The next day, as the class settled into its usual routine, the teacher stood before them, her eyes scanning the room. She had made the decision to address what had happened. She didn't know how or what exactly she was going to say, but she knew that the silence could no longer be ignored. She could feel it, like a heavy presence in the room. The students were watching her, waiting for her to say something, anything. When her gaze landed on the teen, he didn't look at her. He didn't acknowledge her at all. His eyes remained fixed on the desk in front of him. But something in his posture made her hesitate. It wasn't the usual defiance, the usual resistance. It was something else, something quieter but more intense. It was as though he was waiting for her to take the first step, to show that she understood. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She could hear the students shifting in their seats, feeling the tension rise. They knew something was about to happen, something that would change everything. The moment felt electric, like the calm before a storm. Then, unexpectedly, the teen stood up. His chair scraped across the floor as he rose to his feet, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire room held its breath. All eyes turned toward him, as he stood there silently for a heartbeat, his hands clenched at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was steady but low, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. He wasn't looking at anyone, wasn't seeking anyone's approval. He wasn't trying to be dramatic. He was simply speaking his truth. "I'm not angry," he began, his voice carrying in the hushed classroom. "I'm not even upset. I'm just tired. Tired of people thinking they know me, thinking they know my life, just because of where I'm from or what I look like. Tired of being seen as less than. I'm not a lesson for you to learn from. I'm a person. And I deserve to be treated like one." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and the room fell completely still. The teacher's heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts swirling. She wanted to say something, to respond, but for the first time, she realized that there were no easy answers. She couldn't fix this with an apology. There was more to this, so much more, and it was out of her hands now. The teen turned and walked to the door, his steps measured, deliberate. The classroom door clicked shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the silence that followed. The students exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what had just happened. The teacher stood motionless at the front of the room, lost in her own thoughts. The tension in the air was thick. Something had shifted. But what would happen next? The classroom remained eerily silent for what felt like hours, though only a few minutes had passed. The teacher stood frozen, still processing the weight of the words the teen had just left behind. She had known for a while that there were layers to this moment she didn't understand, but now it felt like an avalanche was beginning to descend, and she had no idea how to stop it. She sat down at her desk, her thoughts racing. How had it all gotten this far? How had a simple mistake spiraled into something so much larger than herself? Was she the villain in this story? Could she make it right? And if so, how? But as she tried to collect her thoughts, the phone on her desk buzzed with an incoming message. She picked it up automatically, expecting a quick reminder about the next lesson or an email from a colleague. Instead, it was a notification from the school's principal. The message was brief, but the words hit her like a ton of bricks. "We need to talk. This needs to be addressed immediately. Come to my office after school." Her heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of the message pressing on her chest. Something had changed. The school was involved now. This was bigger than just the classroom, bigger than just one misunderstood comment. What had started as a personal issue between her and the teen had now become a much larger concern. The stakes had been raised, and she could sense that the next few days would be crucial. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her, but her thoughts kept swirling. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the feeling in her gut told her that the teen had spoken to someone. Maybe one of his classmates. Maybe even a parent. Whatever had been said behind the scenes, it had escalated, and now the principal was involved. Meanwhile, the teen's world had shifted dramatically in the hours following his exit from the classroom. He had walked out, not knowing what he was going to do next, but certain that silence would no longer be his answer. There was a fire inside him now, a mix of frustration, confusion, and empowerment. He had never felt this powerful before. The words he had spoken were like a weight lifted off his shoulders, but they also felt like the beginning of something much larger than he could have imagined. When he had left the classroom, he hadn't intended to go anywhere specific. He just needed to breathe, to be alone with his thoughts. But as he wandered through the halls of the school, he found himself in front of the principal's office. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see the principal sitting behind his desk, speaking with a teacher. He felt an urge to enter, to speak up, to be heard again, but he stopped himself. He had already made his statement. He didn't need the principal's approval, or anyone else's. But as he turned to leave, he overheard part of the conversation. The teacher was speaking his teacher. He could only catch snippets, but the words hit him like a shockwave. This could be a real problem. We need to find a way to handle this. I didn't mean for it to go this far. The voice of the teacher trailed off, but what he had heard was enough. His stomach twisted. They were talking about him. They were talking about what had happened in the classroom, and they didn't know how to fix it. His voice, his words, were being reduced to something that could be managed, something to be dealt with. He clenched his fists. He had known that they wouldn't understand. They would try to minimize it, make it seem like he had blown things out of proportion. He had been right to walk away. But hearing them discuss him like some problem to be fixed, made something inside him snap. He wasn't just a problem to be solved. He wasn't just an issue that could be swept under the rug. He was a person, and they needed to see that. His mind raced. The conversation with the teacher was only the beginning. This wasn't over. He had to do something bigger. Something that couldn't be ignored. He had to make them hear him, and not just him, he had to make them see everything that had led up to this moment. As the day wore on, the tension continued to build, both for the teen and for the teacher. The school buzzed with whispers, and by the time the bell rang at the end of the day, the hallways were full of students murmuring about what had happened in class. Some students seemed sympathetic, others were unsure of where they stood. But one thing was clear, the story had spread. Back in the teacher's classroom, she prepared for the meeting with the principal, though her mind was scattered. She had no idea what the outcome would be, but she knew this was more than just a disciplinary issue. This was about something far deeper, a truth that had been simmering under the surface for far too long. The teen had spoken out, and in doing so, he had opened a door she couldn't close. When the bell signaling the end of the school day rang, she packed up her things mechanically, her mind still racing. She had tried to prepare herself, but nothing could have prepared her for the meeting that was about to take place. At the same time, the teen's mind was fixed on one thing: revenge. Not in the traditional sense. He wasn't interested in getting back at anyone. What he wanted was far more powerful. He wanted his truth to be known. He wanted his voice, his experience, to matter. And if they thought they could dismiss him, then he would make sure they had no choice but to listen. That night, he wrote a post, something that felt like it could change everything. He was going to expose the truth, to tell the story his way, to show everyone that silence was no longer an option. He clicked post and felt a surge of adrenaline rush through him as the words hit the screen. The stakes were higher now. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had control over his own destiny. The next day, as the teacher walked into the school, she could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The students were acting different. The whispers were louder now. And then, she saw at the post. It had gone viral. Everywhere she turned, students were talking about it. The teen had taken the story to social media, and now, the world was watching. Her heart sank. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had now become an all-out storm. She was caught in the middle of it, and there was no escaping what was coming next. She could feel the eyes on her as she entered the principal's office. The moment had arrived. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating even. The principal looked at her with a mix of concern and something else, something that felt like the calm before a much larger storm. "It's bigger than we thought," the principal said, his voice tight. "We need to address this now, before it spirals even further." And with that, everything shifted. The tension in the principal's office was palpable, and as the teacher sat across from the principal, the weight of everything that had transpired seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. She had spent the night replaying everything in her mind, trying to figure out how it had gone so wrong, and yet she couldn't make sense of it. The teen's post, which had gone viral, was now the talk of the school and beyond. The comments ranged from supportive to critical, with some defending the teacher's actions, while others were vehement in their condemnation. She knew this was no longer just about her, no longer just about her misunderstanding in class. It had become a much bigger conversation about power, race, and authority. The principal, his face pale and tense, stared at the screen on his desk. He had just finished reading the viral post, and his fingers tapped anxiously on the surface of his desk. This changes everything," he muttered, eyes flicking up to meet the teacher's. "We can't let this spiral further. We have to act quickly. The school board is already involved, and there are calls from parents coming in." The teacher's heart sank as she processed the reality. The teen's words had exposed a truth that was undeniable, and no matter how she tried to justify her actions, it was clear that her role in this was being scrutinized in a way she had never expected. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt him. I made a mistake." The principal's expression softened for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "We all make mistakes. But now we have to figure out what happens next. The story is out there. We can't undo it. But we can control how we respond. We have a choice." As the conversation continued, the door to the principal's office opened, and a counselor entered, holding a stack of papers. She had been working closely with the teen and had seen the fallout from the incident. She spoke gently, her tone calm but firm. "We need to listen to him, truly listen. This is bigger than just a classroom issue. It's about understanding what's been going on behind the scenes for him, and many others, for far too long." The teacher looked down, guilt swelling within her chest. She realized that while she had viewed the incident as a one-off mistake, the teen had seen it as a much bigger pattern, one that was rooted in something deeper. And now, he had found his voice. He was no longer the student he once was, the quiet observer. He was a force, and he wasn't going to back down. As the meeting continued, the teacher's mind kept returning to the moment in the hallway, when she had overheard part of the conversation between the teen and his classmates. She had heard his anger, his frustration, his pain, but she hadn't fully understood it until now. His actions were not just about defending himself, they were a cry for the attention and respect that he had felt denied for far too long. And in his post, he had made sure that everyone saw him, saw his story. Outside the principal's office, the school was in chaos. Students were rallying together in groups, discussing the incident, their voices growing louder as they fueled each other's emotions. The teen, with his post and his truth, had awakened something in them. It was no longer just one individual's struggle, it was a shared experience. The school was a microcosm of a much larger societal issue, one that could no longer be ignored. The teen stood in front of his locker, surrounded by a small group of students. His phone buzzed in his hand, and he saw dozens of notifications flood his screen. Messages of support. Messages of doubt. But most importantly, messages of curiosity. The moment had arrived. The truth had been spoken, and now people wanted to know more. But as he looked at the screen, his thumb hovered over the reply button. The temptation to post more, to make his voice even louder, was overwhelming. But something held him back. He had already said what needed to be said. It wasn't about social media likes or validation anymore. It was about being heard. He turned his attention to the door at the end of the hallway, the one leading to the principal's office. He knew they were in there, discussing everything that had happened. The teacher, the principal, the counselor, his world was being analyzed, picked apart. But he wasn't afraid. He had already exposed the truth. The stakes were higher now, but so was his resolve. In the principal's office, a decision was being made. The school board had already sent a representative to meet with the teacher and the principal. They were preparing to issue a formal statement, and in that moment, the teacher understood just how much was at stake. It was no longer just about her career or the teen's punishment. It was about the school's reputation, its image in the community. It was about whether they could prove they had learned from this, whether they could show they were willing to change. But as they discussed potential responses, something unexpected happened. A knock came at the door. The principal opened it, and a group of students led by a teen entered the room. Their expressions were determined but calm. They were here to take control of the conversation, to ensure their voices were heard. The teacher stood up, her heart racing. This was the moment. This was the point of no return. "We're not here for an apology," the teen said, his voice steady but firm. "We're here because we want to be heard. We're here because we don't want this to happen again, to anyone else. We want you to listen, not to fix things, but to understand." The words hit like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. For the first time, the teacher realized that she had never truly listened. She had always assumed she understood, but in that moment, she saw how much she had missed. The principal looked at the students, his face pale but resolute. He could feel the weight of the situation, but for the first time, he recognized the shift. This was not a problem to be solved, it was a conversation that needed to continue. It was a lesson that the school had failed to teach, and one they now had to learn. But as the teen stood there, with his peers beside him, he felt something unexpected stir within him. He realized that while his voice had been heard, it wasn't enough. This wasn't just about getting validation for his feelings, it was about changing the system. About ensuring that no one else would have to go through what he had. As the meeting came to a close, the principal turned to the teacher and said, "This is only the beginning." And with that, the teen walked out of the office, his heart still racing, but his mind clearer than it had ever been before. The battle wasn't over, but it had only just begun. The weeks that followed that intense meeting in the principal's office were filled with change, both within the school and for the teen. The voices of the students had been heard. What had started as an isolated incident, something that could have been brushed aside, grew into a movement of sorts, a collective push for greater awareness and understanding. The school, recognizing the gravity of the situation, decided to implement a series of workshops and open dialogues. They brought in speakers, community leaders, and even members from the local civil rights organizations to hold discussions about power, respect, and empathy. They didn't just talk about the incident. They dove deeper into the broader issues, discussing how unconscious bias and systemic inequities could affect students' lives in ways they often couldn't see. The teacher, now shaken and humbled by the weight of the event, was assigned to work with a mentor, a counselor who helped her navigate the complex emotions and lessons that came with understanding her role in the incident. It was clear to her that while she had made a mistake, it was an opportunity for growth, both professionally and personally. She started taking steps toward being more mindful, asking her students for their feedback, and checking her own behavior regularly. It wasn't easy, but she knew it was necessary. The teen, on the other hand, was beginning to feel a sense of validation, but it was mixed with an awareness that his journey wasn't over. He had spoken out, and the school had acknowledged the mistake. But that didn't mean things had suddenly become perfect. He saw how many of his classmates had gained a new understanding of what had happened, but there were still those who felt uncomfortable with the idea of change, and they expressed it in subtle ways. Some were quiet about their discomfort, while others voiced their opinions more boldly. The teen knew that the road ahead would require more work, more listening, and more patience, but he wasn't deterred. This was bigger than just one mistake. This was about creating a space where everyone could feel safe, seen, and respected. As the semester continued, the teen began to notice subtle changes. The dynamics of the school were shifting. Some students who had once been silent started engaging in the conversations. The once quiet hallways now buzzed with discussions of equality, fairness, and respect. There was a palpable energy, an air of transformation that wasn't there before. One afternoon, after school had let out, the teen found himself sitting in the courtyard, his phone buzzing in his pocket. He checked it briefly and saw a message from one of his classmates, someone he hadn't talked to much before. The message was short but powerful. "Hey, I get it now. Thanks for speaking up." The teen smiled to himself. It wasn't an earth-shattering change, but it was a shift in perspective, a quiet acknowledgement that things could be different if everyone just listened, really listened, to one another. At the same time, the teacher, who had been undergoing her own transformation, found herself standing in front of her class again. This time, she didn't just go through the motions. She took a moment before starting the lesson, her eyes scanning the room. Her students were looking at her differently now, and she could feel the weight of their expectations. They were waiting to see if she had truly changed. She knew that her words and actions in the coming days would determine whether she had earned back their trust. She began the class by saying something that she had never thought to say before. "I made a mistake. And I've been trying to understand how that mistake hurt you. Not just you, but everyone who saw it. I want to do better. I'm here to listen to you." The students were silent at first, processing what she had said. Then, slowly, one by one, they nodded, acknowledging her sincerity. It was a small moment, but it was significant. Outside, the world continued to turn, but for those in the school, something had shifted. The incident had sparked a ripple effect. It had opened up a conversation that many had avoided for years, a conversation about race, respect, and the responsibility of educators. No one was pretending that everything was fixed. There was still work to be done. But the change had begun. As the school year drew to a close, the teen found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about how much had changed in such a short period of time. He thought about the late-night phone calls with friends, discussing the impact of his post. He thought about the emotional weight of standing up, of taking a stance when he had so often been taught to stay quiet. But most of all, he thought about the people he had met along the way, people who had seen him, truly seen him, for the first time. There were still moments when he felt frustrated, when he wished the world could change faster. But he had learned something valuable: change was never instant. It came slowly, often painfully, and it required everyone involved to work toward it. On the last day of school, there was a small ceremony to acknowledge the students who had made a difference. The teen didn't expect to be recognized, but when his name was called, he stood up, unsure of what to say. The principal, standing on the stage, looked at him with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "You've taught us all an important lesson," the principal said, his voice steady but emotional. "That speaking up, even when it's hard, is the first step toward creating change." The teen's heart swelled with pride, but there was no grand speech to follow. Instead, he simply said, "I'm just trying to make sure no one else feels invisible." The room was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, the applause began. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but it was real. It was the kind of applause that didn't just come from admiration, but from a shared understanding. As the ceremony ended and students began filing out of the room, the teen caught sight of the teacher in the back of the auditorium. She was watching him with a soft smile, a quiet nod of acknowledgement. They had both learned something about the importance of listening, of being willing to admit when they were wrong, and of working toward a better future. Their paths had crossed in an unexpected way, but it had been a necessary intersection. The school wasn't perfect, and neither was the world outside. But for the first time in a long while, the teen felt a sense of hope. He didn't know exactly where the road would take him, but he knew it was a road worth walking. As the summer began and the echoes of the school year faded, the teen felt ready to face whatever came next. The fight for change wasn't over, but it had found its spark. And as long as that spark remained, he would keep fighting. And somewhere, in the depths of the school, the teacher, too, was beginning her own journey. She was no longer the same person who had stood in that classroom, unaware of the damage she had done. She had learned, and she would continue to learn, every single day. The lesson had been painful, but it had been necessary. And in the end, it was the kind of lesson that would stay with them both for a lifetime.